This is the Unit 3 overview lecture video. Unit 3 talks about early childhood, which is the ages between about 2 and 6. So for Chapter 8, we are talking about the biosocial development in early childhood. The first topic that we kind of go into is nutrition and picky eating. And right off the bat, I want to talk about one of the questions in the journal assignment. It asks about children letting them eat only when they want to. So this one, again, is kind of a vague question. You could kind of look at it either way. I just want you guys to make sure you understand that the question says that they eat only when they want and not only what they want. So there's a big difference between those. I think when you think letting kids eat whatever they want, obviously that's not the right answer. That's not what we want to do. But when we talk about when a child is eating, there's a section in Chapter 8 about childhood obesity and this tendency that, especially in America, other countries don't always necessarily have the same problems that we do in our culture, but based on our culture, we have this tendency to want to force children to eat. We want to tell them, you have to clean your plate and then you can have dessert or something like that, where we kind of have a little bit of an obsession with making sure people are eating enough food for some reason. I think some of this goes back to worries about getting enough nutrition and children not being healthy, making sure that they're eating a lot. So in this stage of age 2 to 6, children's appetites naturally decrease. They do not need as many calories per pound as they did when they were infants because they're not growing quite as much. Obviously, they grow a whole lot more when they're infants, so they're going to be eating a whole lot more calories. Then they go through this phase in early childhood where they're starting to slim down anyway, naturally, because they're growing taller and they're not gaining as much weight. They're losing that baby fat. And then their metabolisms just don't need as many calories. So the appetite is going to naturally decrease during this time. So it's very normal for a child in this age group to not want to eat all of the time. So I think the idea behind this question is, yes, it is very important to have family meal times, and we'll learn about the importance of family meal times in the adolescent unit, especially when we talk about eating disorders. It is very important to sit down together as a family and eat meals together at the same time. I think for this question, the focus is on, though, forcing a child to eat when they're not hungry. The practice of trying to bribe a child to eat or making them clean their plate or they can't leave the table or something like that, it really does encourage bad habits in this age group of forcing someone to eat when they're not hungry, and then their bodies don't learn to regulate that, and then that really can cause childhood obesity in the later years. So just for this question, think about that aspect of it as well. Obviously, it's super important when we are having family meals to offer healthy foods. We want a variety of foods, fruits and vegetables and whole grains, and less of the fried foods and processed foods. Children that are picky eaters do tend to want to eat more junk food than healthy food. So yes, it is important to offer those things, but it's also important to remember that if a child says they're not hungry, then they're not hungry and they should not be forced to eat. And part of that will help is to not let them eat a bunch of snacks all the time when it's not mealtime. So yes, family meal times are important. So for that question, you can kind of see both sides of it. Just make sure you're always putting textbook evidence and backing up your answer. Okay, enough about that. So the next topic is the just right phenomenon, which makes me chuckle because I've seen toddlers in this stage so often, and I think when you're in the middle of it, you kind of have a tendency to want to control them, and you freak out a little bit, and no, you can't wear the blue cowboy boots to church every week or whatever it is. As you get a little older and your children grow out of this a little bit, I think you can gain a little more perspective on this is a temporary thing. It's kind of funny sometimes. Just be patient and they will grow out of it. But please watch the video on the just right phenomenon. It's a really cute, funny video that was made by a student. And it just describes the just right phenomenon. So make sure you use that reference to that video when you're answering that question. Okay, then we'll talk a little bit about brain development. So ages 2 to 6 is a big time for brain development. They are working on myelination. This process actually continues all the way through adolescence. So it's not like they're myelinating only during this time, but the myelination increases. So what myelination is it's this kind of white matter in the brain that kind of cushions the ends of the neurons, which helps when the neurons fire from one to the other. Myelination helps that speed up a little bit. So the processing speed goes up as the myelination increases. And especially when the myelination is happening in the corpus callosum, that's a big brain development step because that helps the two sides of the brain start to connect with each other and balance. So when we're looking at lateralization, for example, when it's left-handed or right-handed, things like that, that's all having to do with that corpus callosum, which is the band that of nerves that connects in the middle in between the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain. So when we're looking at motor skills and things like that, we need that myelination to be happening in the corpus callosum to connect those sides of the brain so that they can kind of coordinate with each other. One of the aspects of brain development during this stage is that the frontal lobe is developing, or the prefrontal cortex, it calls it both in the textbook. It is developing during this stage, but it's definitely still very immature, so it's not quite there yet. And actually, it won't get there for quite some time. We'll be talking about this frontal lobe in future units as well, so keep that in mind. So impulsiveness and preservation. When you watch the video about the little girl with the birthday cake, she is preserving this idea of the birthday song needs to be a certain way, and she just cannot let it go. So preservation is that idea of kind of getting stuck in an emotion or getting stuck on an idea, and they can't get themselves out of it. And then impulsiveness would be kind of almost the opposite of it, which is not really thinking too much and kind of bouncing from thing to thing, short attention span, no thought before they just jump right into something. An example of this would be in my own life when at that time, 2-year-old daughter jumped into the swimming pool because she wanted to go swimming, and she was fully clothed, and we were not swimming at that time, but she saw the swimming pool, and so she jumped into it. Obviously, we had to jump in fully clothed after her. So impulsiveness, just there's not a whole lot of planning. There's not a whole lot of executive function going on quite yet, which is very common in this early childhood stage. Okay, and then the last part of the brain development is the emotional development happening in the amygdala. This is part of the limbic system, which is developing during this stage. So the amygdala is in charge of emotion. So that's just something to remember when you're answering some of the questions about emotional development. And then, so just study these 3 different parts of the brain: the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the hypothalamus. The hippocampus is in charge of memory, and the hypothalamus is in charge of hormone regulation. And then moving on to motor skills, which I touched on a little bit before with that myelination going on and the lateralization, the brain is starting to be more coordinated as far as using both sides at the same time. There's a chart on page 238 that kind of shows what to expect during this age of which ages, when is it that they can start to hop on one foot or to skip. Some of the questions will focus on skipping. So look at that chart and kind of see what the norms are for what to expect. Gross motor skills will develop before fine motor skills do. So gross motor skills are the bigger muscles that you're using, something like running or jumping or catching a ball. And then fine motor skills are the smaller motions like writing with a pencil or buttoning up a button or something like that. So obviously the fine motor skills take a little bit longer just because the motions are more precise, and there has to be a lot more coordination going on in the brain for those to be able to develop. Then we'll move into injuries and child abuse. So the main thing about injuries is understanding the difference between the primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. So I'll give you another story from my own kids as just an example of how this is used. So we're at the playground, for example, and a primary prevention of injury would be just the playground setup itself. So they're going to put some soft floor type of stuff down underneath the playground. You can't have a playground on top of concrete because if a child falls, then there's nothing to absorb the shock. So that's why there's always sand or something softer underneath the playground equipment. That would be a primary prevention. Then secondary is when you're actually doing something risky. So, for example, if you know that your child is not really good at crossing the monkey bars just quite yet, but they want to try, you would go stand underneath the monkey bars while they're crossing instead of sitting over on a bench and just watching. So that would be a secondary prevention. And then tertiary prevention would be after an injury happens, being able to take them to the doctor or give them medicine or whatever to try to make the injury less severe. So my daughter dislocated her shoulder when she was probably only 3 years old at a playground falling off of monkey bars. So I could have done a little better about my secondary prevention. I think I was probably not there quite quick enough to catch her, and she fell and had to go get her shoulder popped back into joint, which was then tertiary. So it would have been better to catch her on the primary or the secondary, but things happen. That's one of the themes of this early childhood is that they get into everything and they're very curious. And so obviously accidents, there are a lot more accidents that happens during this time. So the next topic is child abuse. Look at page 250. There's a chart that gives some warning signs. The main thing to remember about child abuse is that even if it's just a suspicion, any suspicion of child abuse should be reported. It's not that person's job to necessarily substantiate the claims and have hard and fast evidence, but if there's even a suspicion, then you turn that over to the authorities and then they can figure out if the claim is substantiated or not. It's much better to be safe than sorry. There are laws that vary by state, so it really does depend on which state you're in. If you are in a profession like teaching or nursing or counseling or something like that, chances are you will be a mandated reporter, which means you are required by law to report any suspicion of child abuse. Okay, then we'll move on to Chapter 9, which is cognitive development. And again, here we see Piaget is our cognitive specialist. So in this age group, the children are in the pre-operational stage. So some features of the pre-operational stage is that language development is really taking off. There's a lot of imagination going on. We have imaginary friends and things like that during this stage. They are not logical thinkers at all. That logic does not come in until the next stage. They're very egocentric, which I want to explain what egocentric means. You might think it means that they're selfish, but that's actually not exactly what it means. It just means that they cannot understand the perspective of another person. They can only see things through their perspective. So an example of this, why it's not selfishness, is in gift giving. So if you've ever had a young child want to pick out a birthday present for someone, chances are they're going to want to pick out something that they love, the child themselves. So say your 3-year-old is really into fire trucks and you're trying to pick out a birthday present for grandma. Little 3-year-old is going to say, let's get grandma a fire truck, because he thinks that that is what grandma would love because that's what he loves. So he just can't understand that someone else would have a different perspective than what his perspective is. And irreversibility is this idea that once something is done, it cannot be undone. So in the Dear Abbeys, there's a question about making a sandwich and putting pickles on it, I think. That's a classic example of irreversibility. They think once something is done, it cannot be undone. And then focus on appearance. So you'll see some videos about conservation. It's this idea that you'll have a liquid and then you'll have 2 identical containers of liquid. And then you pour one of the containers into a different size so that it looks taller or shorter or something like that. So even though they've seen it being the exact same amount of liquid, once it's poured, then they think there's more in the other glass because it's taller. So they're only focusing on what they can see. They can't imagine that differences of something just because it looks a certain way, they take it at face value. So they do not have conservation at this stage, and you'll see those experiments in the observation assignment. Okay, the next big person that we want to talk about with this cognitive development in the early childhood stage is Vygotsky. He was all about social learning. Vygotsky studied learning as far as mentoring and learning just by being around someone that's more experienced. This idea of guided participation is that you have a mentor, somebody that has already learned how to do the thing that you're trying to do, and they show you as they're working, and you learn hands-on kind of in the moment. It's much less about reading something out of a textbook. It's more about just going and experiencing and learning from someone who has more experiences. The zone of proximal development, we've already talked about in a previous lecture. That's that sweet spot of just beyond a person's capability of what they could do by themselves. But when you have a mentor, then you can push them into the zone of proximal development and get them to the next level of something that they would not have been able to do by themselves. And scaffolding is when we provide that support as they're going through this process of trying to learn something new, that the mentor is supporting them, kind of guiding them as they go. The theory of mind, you'll see the adorable video about the crayon box, which I love. So the theory of mind is basically the idea that you can think about what someone else might be thinking. So you're going to try to guess what's on their mind. It's this idea of mind reading, really. What would that person be thinking? So under age 4, the children typically cannot understand what someone else would be thinking. It's back to this idea of egocentrism. So in the experiment that they're doing with the crayon box, you'll see that some of the children don't have the theory of mind because they cannot put themselves in someone else's shoes to think about what that person might be thinking, because they might not have all the information that I have. And that, again, develops around age 4, but not necessarily always and fully, and to have a logical reason for why someone would say the thing that they said. Okay, and then language development is, again, a big topic during this stage of life. There's the fast mapping going on and the vocabulary explosion, so just make sure you understand what's going on with language development, and then early childhood education. Know the difference between these types of preschool settings, Montessori, Reggio Emilia, teacher-directed, and intervention. There'll be some questions about different types of preschool settings and what might be going on in different kinds of preschools and what kind of preschool you might prefer for your own child. And then in Chapter 10, it's again about the psychosocial development during early childhood. This first part focuses on emotional development, and there's a question about fears. Why are childhood fears more common? What were your childhood fears? Things like that. The reason why they're more common isn't specifically clear in the textbook. It's basically the idea that because their brains are so imaginative, and because they don't quite have that logical understanding yet, they really can't tell the difference between what's imaginary and what's real. So there's a lot of development in the emotional centers, which bring on that fear emotion, but then there's not a whole lot of logic to balance it out. So that would be the answer to why fears are more common during this age. But the main thing that I want you guys to think about is, how do parents deal with these emotions? Fear is the one listed specifically in the question, but really emotions just all across the board. How should parents react and deal with these emotions that are going on? And the main thing that I want to get across is that parents need to validate the emotion, not to dismiss the emotion. So instead of saying like, oh, there's nothing to be afraid of, you would say, oh, I can see that you're scared of that, and we're going to talk about it. And then you kind of help guide them through how to regulate that emotion rather than just dismissing it. Okay, so then we'll move on to play. So you need to know the benefits of sociodramatic and rough and tumble play. These are kind of these two. One is typically associated with girls, the other typically associated with boys, but there's actually benefits for boys and girls for both sides of it. So when we hear the question about a boy that's doing sociodramatic play, that's actually beneficial for him. And so we're going to talk about the benefits of both types of play. So when we're answering questions about this, we just want to make sure that we're talking about both types and that both types are good and that all children can participate in both types and that they're both beneficial. The next topic I want to go into a little more detail about is parenting styles. This is one of those big, overarching, important topics that we'll continue to see throughout the next few units. Parenting styles is a really, really important topic for child development. So Diana Baumrind introduced these 4 kind of categories, and the way that she differentiated between the categories was a scale of warmth, which would be affection and love and that kind of thing, versus discipline, which would be expectations, punishments, strictness, rules, things like that. So the first type that we're going to talk about is authoritarian. So you need to really be careful about the difference between authoritarian and authoritative, which is the third type that we'll talk about in a minute. So authoritarian is low on warmth and high on discipline. So they're the very strict parents. This is a lot of rules, a lot of high expectations without a whole lot of understanding or conversation or affection. This is the mom that says, because I said so, and gives no explanation as to why. This would be the really strict, harsh disciplinarians that it's my way or the highway, and there's no room for interpretation or for conversation or for circumstances even. Okay, then permissive parents are high on the warmth and love and affection, but they are low on the discipline. So these are the kind of parents that spoil the kids and they let them kind of get away with anything, and they don't really have a structure or a bedtime or a whole lot of rules, and they kind of just get whatever they want. So these are two very opposite ends of the spectrum, and neither one of these have really great results when it comes to how the kids turn out. And there is a section in the textbook that explains kind of what the typical results are for each of these types, and neither one of these have great outcomes. So the one with the best outcomes, the one with that has been tested and scientifically proven to be the best type as far as the outcomes for the children, are authoritative parents, which is sort of a mix in the middle, which makes sense because we need to find a balance in all things. They are high on warmth and affection and love, but they're also high on discipline and rules and expectations. So when we talk about being high on discipline, that doesn't mean they're constantly punishing their kids. It just means that they have high expectations and they do set rules and they do have structure. But that within being reasonable and being able to talk about the rules and explain why a rule is the way it is. And instead of just saying, because I said so, like an authoritarian parent would, an authoritative parent would explain why. Well, we have this rule to keep you safe, and it's because we love you. And then they would, give the child a chance to be a part of the conversation. Maybe the child even helps to set some of the guidelines. So it's high expectations with the understanding that that they make sense and that they're reasonable and that there is still a lot of love that goes along with the discipline. And again, these have the best outcomes for the children. And then the last type is neglectful, which is low on both. They are just kind of uninvolved. They don't have a lot of warmth or affection, but they also don't have a lot of discipline or structure. And then The last topic, which goes along with this, is the difference between discipline and punishment. Please watch the video, A Lesson They'll Never Forget. This is like my favorite, well, not really my favorite. It's kind of a heart-wrenching video when you watch it, but it really shows, it illustrates this concept that I want to talk about. And the Dr. Hart that you'll see in the video was actually one of my professors during my undergrad at BYU, and he's phenomenal. And I talk all the time about him to my family because the things that I learned from him really did shape the way that I parent, and he's just fantastic. So please watch that video. So the difference between discipline and punishment. I would say discipline is more about teaching, and punishment is more about just making the behavior stop or doling out, making someone pay for their crimes. Basically, what they did was wrong So discipline, I think about the word disciple and how Christ would discipline the people that he was around, or he would teach. I mean, that's really what it was all about. And when we are a disciple, we're learners and we're followers. And so as parents, the best example that we have of how to parent is Jesus Christ and how he treated the people that he was around. He did have high expectations and absolutely had rules. Obviously, we have a lot of rules and commandments that we have to follow, but they're always shown with love. And we know that Christ has that deep and unconditional love for us. So that would be the main thing that I would say is the difference between discipline and punishment, is that discipline really has that aspect of teaching. And if you teach while you're disciplining, that really does help the lesson to set in for, okay, I know that what I did was wrong, and then what can I do better the next time? And why shouldn't I have done that? And then what can I do differently? And then punishment is really just about making someone pay for what they did. And there's really not a whole lot of aspect of teaching in that. So when we watch the spanking going on in the video, it's not really working because we see it again and again and again, and they keep having to do it. And I mean, it might momentarily stop the behavior, but then there's no long-term lesson for how to do it better the next time. So discipline definitely takes a lot more patience than punishment. But in the long run, discipline works a lot better than punishment works. So that's something that I'm very passionate about. I hope that you will look at my notes from instructor page, and I kind of talk about some scriptural references and things like that. And this is a topic that is very dear to my heart. So if you have any questions about Unit 3, please let me know, and I'll be talking to you guys soon.